Okay, today is our second class on the book of Nehemiah. And we're going to look at the major events in the book this morning, survey through what happened, and observe in the course of that who the important people were and the places of these particular events. The book of Nehemiah records the events that covered probably about a 12 or 13 or 14 year period, as we noticed yesterday. And these events started off with Nehemiah, the king's cupbearer, chapter 1, in the palace in Shushan in Babylon, or Persia. And his brother returns with several other men from Judah, and that's the setting for the events. The first 3 verses in the book tell us that Hanani, one of my brothers, came, he and certain men of Judah, and they had contact with Nehemiah, and he asked them how things were going back there in the land. And they gave a very negative report. The remnant who are left of the captivity there in the province are in great affliction and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem also is broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. And it's that part of the message that the Spirit of God used to smite Nehemiah in his spirit. And the first chapter of this book then shows us the spiritual preparation that took place over the rest of that month as Nehemiah fasted and prayed and petitioned God for help to do what he was burdened to do, and that was to go back and to solve this dilemma of the reproach and the affliction of the people. In the first verse it says that Nehemiah was in the palace in the 20th year, and in the month Kislev. And the second chapter, first verse, says that in the month Nisan, in the 20th year, I think it's the next month, just a matter of a couple of weeks, Nehemiah prayed and fasted. Chapter 2 gives us an extensive summary of events that swiftly followed. In the first 8 verses, Nehemiah is in the presence of the king, and he is finally given the fearful opportunity of presenting his request for the privilege of going back and building the city. And also he asks for supplies and means. It says that he was standing before the king and the queen, and he was very fearful. I guess even though the Persians were benevolent people, remember the old law of was Artaxerxes or Ahasuerus? I guess it was Ahasuerus. Couldn't come into the king's presence without. Now this one had been a former law, probably, but couldn't come into the king's presence unbidden upon pain of death. So still pretty stringent court rules. And this is quite an act of faith. Man is putting his life on the line. God honored that request. It says that the king gave him his request, chapter 2, verse 8. And the last part of the verse says, the king granted me according to the good hand of my God upon me. So the king said yes. Verses 9 to 11 in the second chapter tell us that he crossed the Euphrates River, verse 9, and he arrives in Jerusalem, verse 11, and he was there 3 days. Now, what the text doesn't tell us that it probably took him 4 or 5 months to get there. right? He probably had a fairly large retinue of supplies, helpers. We know that this was no mere weekend excursion because he was there 12 years. It's interesting how the king would let him go for that long. So this was a major move. So Nehemiah's request is granted, and he arrives in Jerusalem. In the first 3 days, he meets the Jews and the enemy, verse 10, and he sees the situation. The very first thing he did, verses 12 to 16, is he got up in the middle of the night. He had a couple of fellows with him, didn't tell anybody what he was doing, and he went out and he checked things out under cover of darkness. Went around the whole city, checked out the walls to find out what condition they were in. Then he returned home. And the rest of chapter 2 is telling us the very first intimations that Nehemiah gives of his job. I don't know whether he had kept the king's letter giving him permission to return as a trump card for this very specific occasion, or whether he had already indicated to the leaders that he was coming back to rebuild Jerusalem. It seems in verse 10 that these enemies were grieved because they recognized him as a man who had come to seek the welfare of the children of Israel. It's definitely a Jewish embassy, but exactly how much they knew, I don't know. Anyway, they soon did know. Nehemiah stood up and speaking to the people, he, out of necessity, had to let the cat out of the bag, and the enemies began to realize it too. So he strengthened the Jews, and they decided that we're going to go with it. Verse 18, they said, "Let us rise up and build." So they strengthened their hands with this good work. So the Jews enthusiastically supported Nehemiah's decision, his proposition, and immediately there is opposition from 3 individuals, Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. These 3 men are, all the way through this book, considered to be the leadership of the enemy. Tobiah calls him the servant, the Ammonite. This man may even have been some relation. The last chapter of the book of Nehemiah indicates that he had a very close working relationship with the high priest in Nehemiah's absence, and that he was allowed to worship in the temple in his own little cubicle. And there were intermarriages between his family and the Jews. So you can see that they were compromised, and the enemy was very close. So the very first thing that the enemies do is laugh them to scorn, verse 19, and despised them, so ridiculed them. And Nehemiah immediately answers that, well, laugh all you like, the God of heaven will prosper us. God's on our side. Chapter 3 gives us a summary of the people that worked on the wall and what they did. I didn't have a map, or I didn't have time to check a map out to actually visualize this, but I'll try to do that when we make up notes. It lists 40 different individuals in the 3rd chapter, plus the men of 5 different cities, plus the Levites and the priests. It lists the members of one man's family. He had a number of daughters that helped build. It mentions goldsmiths and merchants. That wasn't a whole lot of people to rebuild the walls of the city. Pretty large undertaking. And they did it in 52 days. 52 days. 4 weeks. No, 8 weeks. Right? 7 weeks. So it mentions that he goes through an order. He starts in chapter 3, verse 1. He mentions that certain people were responsible for the sheep gate and the walls that extended from one side of it. And then the walls adjacent to the fish gate, verses 4 and 5. And then the old gate, verse 6. And the walls besides that. He mentions the broad wall in verse 8. In verses 10 and 11, the tower of the furnaces, whatever that meant. Verse 13, he talks about the valley gate. The people of this particular town built not only the valley gate, but 1,000 cubits of the wall into the dung gate. 1,000 cubits. That's 1,500 feet. 500 yards. 500 yards of wall. People of Zanoah. Onto the dung gate. Verse 14, it mentions the dung gate. Verse 15, they rebuilt the gate of the fountain and the wall that came around to David's stairs. I think verses 17 to 20 describe the wall that went along the southern part of the city and up past the southeast corner, past the projecting tower, verses 24 and 25, and then the water gate, and then the horse gate, verse 28, and then back up to the sheep gate in verse 32. So the third chapter of this book describes the rebuilding of the walls, starting, I think, at the northeast corner, and then going counterclockwise. Chapters 4 through first part of 6 describe the opposition that the Jews encountered in this process. I've never preached on the book of Nehemiah myself, outside of a couple of biographical studies, but I've heard Jack Crowell preach on the book of Nehemiah. And it's interesting that there are, you can see principles, put it that way, in the way that these people opposed the physical work of the Jews to the kinds of opposition. There's only so many kinds of opposition that you can get. And we've already seen that they ridiculed them and harassed them. That becomes more definitive in the first 9 verses of chapter 4. These people are angry, and so he went and talked with his friends, and verse 3, Tobiah said, doesn't matter what they're doing, even if a little fox goes up, you'll be able to knock down the wall. And they looked at all the negative aspects. What are these feeble Jews doing? They were weak. Will they fortify themselves? It appeared as if they were going to try to resurrect the Jewish monarchy. Will they sacrifice? They were intimating that this was inconsistent with just their temple worship, which they've been doing since the days of Ezra. What does this have to do with sacrifice? Will they finish in a day? It's going to take you guys forever. You could, if you did a modern day parable on this, that's the way you phrase it. Look at these stones, and they've all been burnt, and they're going to crack, and you can't. Where are they going to get the stonework? You got to get it somewhere. Can't use those things. So they looked at all the obstacles and publicized them, ridiculed them. And the answer that Nehemiah gives is that he simply turns to the Lord, doesn't answer them at all. "O our God, we are despised." They're laughing at us, Lord. Turn it around on them. And, they're sinners. And verse 6 is an interesting verse, I suppose. It's probably the key verse to the book, or one of them. "So built we the wall, and all the wall was joined together to half of its height, for the people had a mind to work." So the response to verbal ridicule is simply getting at it, just doing the work, committing yourself to the Lord. And then there was conspiracy in verses 7 and 8. These enemies getting angrier and angrier as they saw the breaches of the walls being closed. And they threatened. They didn't actually do anything about it, but they threatened to get together and fight against the Jews, which forced Nehemiah, when he heard about it, to set a watch against them day and night, 24 hours a day. Now, this leads to the next type of this opposition, in verses 10 to the end of the chapter. For two things worked in tandem to discourage these people. Number one was the fact that there was so much garbage. Verse 10. The bearers of burdens, the strength of the bearers of the burdens is decayed. There's much rubbish, so that we are not able to build a wall. I don't think you and I really have much ability to comprehend what it must have been like. These walls were yards thick and, probably 30 or 40 feet high. And when they were burned, it was just a great big pile. And they had to move all that stuff. And somebody was saying, I was just reading in one of those books from the Zion Chronicles, that when they laid the foundations for those walls, 85 feet underground. 85 feet underground. Like, that is to the present level. But I mean, the walls are still standing. So, or at least a portion of the wall is still standing. And that was a massive job. It's an understatement. The strength of the people is decayed. They're losing strength, right? So that was bound to be discouraging. There weren't that many people in the city. As we'll see later on in the book, they actually had to ask for volunteers to move into the city of Jerusalem, just to have enough people to man the administration and look after the town. And furthermore, to add to the fact that they were getting tired because there was just so much work to do, the word was being spread out in the hinterland around Jerusalem that the people that would leave their homes to come to work on the city, and there were people coming from all in the area, that they were going to be attacked at night when they went home. See if I can find that. Verse 12, "It came to pass that when the Jews who dwelt by them came, they said unto us 10 times, From all places where you shall return unto us, they will be upon you." So they were threatening to ambush these people when they went back home. And as a result, this was putting the fear into people, as you can well imagine. Verse 14, Nehemiah said his response was a practical response. The next time you come, bring your family with you. And that's exactly what they did. And bring your weapons, whatever you have. And what he did was inside the wall while they were working. The wall was already half high. They put all their family with all their weapons. Then they put the workers on the wall. And if there was threat of attack, they would simply just, everybody jump up on the wall. Right? Or they'd have the weapons available, and they made a plan. The guys that worked on the wall would have their weapons with them. Verse 17, weapon in one hand, instruments in the other. And they devised a plan that if they heard a trumpet anywhere on the wall, that people would go from other places and gather to fight the battle. It never actually developed that they had to fight that way, but they had a plan. So the Nehemiah's response to this particular type of opposition was to be well prepared, right? To take practical, common sense measures. And verse 23 is a one-line summary of just how hard the work was. They worked so hard they didn't have time to take off their clothes except for ritual washing. Right, the first 5 verses of chapter 5 introduces to a third kind of opposition, and that was that the Jews that had already settled in the city of Jerusalem now, their property, their food, their stores were being eaten up by all the people that had been brought into the city for safekeeping. And so they were willing to give them their food, but they were mortgaging their property. Well, you want to eat? Okay, you have to sign a deed saying that I've got the ownership of your vineyard out in Gibeah, you know. And people got to the place where they just couldn't take it anymore because they were caught between a rock and a hard place. They were mortgaged out, and then they'd have to mortgage themselves for slaves once their property was gone. And it was, they were in a hopeless case. The response to this was to confront the selfishness of the people that lived in the city of Jerusalem. And that's exactly what Nehemiah did. He rebuked these nobles and rulers, and he had a great assembly in verse 7 against these people, and told them to give it all back, and they did. And the 5th chapter concludes with Nehemiah's own unselfish example. It says that he said that in the 12 or 13 years that he was there, he didn't take his normal stipend that the governor of the land, the governors of the land that preceded him had taken. He paid for his own food and everything right out of his own pocket. And in fact, there were 150 Jews and rulers, he says in verse 17, that he fed at his own table for 12 years. And he never charged, he never taxed the people to pay for that or anything. So I think that's probably why he was successful in convincing the other Jews to respond that way.
So every year, we went through about 2,200 sheep and 5 ox.
He wasn't by any means a poor man.
Did he bring it all with him? This is quite a oxen. It's quite a...
I don't know. Whether he just had money when he came and bought it when he got there, or I don't know. I suppose there's Jewish tradition that tells us. Maybe Josephus will have something to say about it. In the 6th chapter, we have the final step of opposition, and that was they tried to. There was a letter writing campaign between Tobiah, this guy that was sort of close to the Jewish leaders, and a lot of Jews were compromised. They were Jews and they wanted to see the work go forward, but they owed, they had debts and commitments, right, to the enemy, and if they didn't want to lose it all, they had to go with the enemy. So they did. So they were writing letters to try to resolve this and to weaken Nehemiah's resolve, which of course he rejected. The last step of opposition was that these guys tried to lure him away outside of the city of Jerusalem. 4 times they sent embassies to him. 4 times he rejected it. The 5th time they came with an open letter right into the city and laid their charges out in front of him to try to make him look bad in the eyes of the people. And verse 6 It is reported among the nations, and Gash Mew saith it, that you and the Jews think to rebel, for which cause you build the wall, that you may be their king according to these words. So they were attributing false motives to him, making him look bad. He said in verse 7, furthermore, you have appointed prophets to proclaim concerning yourself in Jerusalem. Now it shall be reported to the king concerning, the news is going to get back to Artaxerxes, and you're going to get into trouble. So come on, meet with us, and we'll try to keep these things from happening, is the implication. The answer to this was simply a firm no to all their charges. None of that's true. Verse 8. Then I sent unto him, saying, there are no such things done as you say, but you invent them in your own heart. And so Nehemiah has responded to each of these things firmly and in defense upon the Lord. Verse 9, now therefore, O God, strengthen my hands. The success story is recorded in verses 15 and 16. So the wall was finished in the 25th day of the month Elul in 50 and 2 days. It came to pass when all our enemies heard of this, and all the nations that were round about us saw these things, that they were much cast down in their own eyes. And they perceived that this work was wrought by our God. So by the 6th chapter of Nehemiah, now let's just stop for a moment. Nehemiah was here for about 12 years. And the wall was done within the first 2 months. Right? The very first priority was to get that wall done, security. And he got it done. And yet he stayed there for the rest of the 11 point some years, and we have a record of some of the significant things starting in chapter 7 that he was involved in this period of time. One major project was to number the people and take inventory of the possessions of the people. Wanted to find out exactly what they owned, what the economic base was. Before that, he assigned administrative leadership, chapter 7, verses 1 to 2. Actually, 1 to 4. So first step, he established a civil administration composed of 2 men, his own brother, Hanani, and the ruler of the palace by the name of Hananiah. This is the first intimation we have of it, but apparently the king had allowed Hananiah, the ruler of his own palace, to return with Nehemiah. He's described as a faithful man and feared God more than many. So he trusted his own brother, and then this godly man, a lot of experience. He put these 2 guys in charge of the city. The rest of chapter 7 describes the 42,366 people that had come in the days of Ezra and who still lived in the surrounding area. It wasn't just the people in Jerusalem here. They owned about 7,500 servants, and they owned about 8,000 beasts of burden. There's only 8,000 camels and horses and donkeys under Jewish control. These were crucial steps. And it says by the 7th month, at the end of chapter 7, the last verse, it says, when the 7th month came, the children of Israel were in the cities. So 52 days is just over 7 weeks, almost 2 months. So within 5 months' time of the completion of the wall, Nehemiah had taken a census of all the Jews in the land, and he had also taken a census of their basic possessions. Chapter 6 through 10 in the book. The bulk of the remainder of the record in this book. You're looking for a just a minute. Southeast corner, right? Mount Moriah. It's different from the temple?
Temple's north.
Okay, so within 2 months the wall was finished. Within 5 months he had established a civil administration. He had taken a census of the people and taken inventory of their basic possessions. This brought it to the 7th month after his return. And immediately after that, the most notable thing that took place within these 12 years that we have record of is a great revival under Ezra. The first day of the 7th month, in chapter 8, 4 things happened. People were gathered, the law was read to them all morning, then it was explained to them by about 26 different leaders that were up on the stage with Ezra, and the people were exhorted to be happy. Be happy, don't worry, don't mourn. The reason they strongly urged them to rejoice is because there's strength and joy. Neither be ye grieved, for the joy of the Lord is your strength. I think that's a message that needs to be preached today, you know that? I know I need to hear it. The joy of the Lord is your strength. It's so easy when you're discouraged, right? Or disgruntled or depressed to be weak. And these people were mourning and weeping, verse 9, because they realized their weaknesses and their failures and their shortcomings. This, by the way, is one of the great formal services recorded in Scripture. There's not very many of them. I just noticed this last week. I was going through the Scripture and how that in the whole Bible there is only about maybe a dozen or so specific examples recorded in Jewish history where people were gathered in great meetings to hear God's word.
Here's verse 5. The reads all the law, the scriptures, and all the people stood up.
Mm-hmm. Why'd you do that? That's you're going to use that as a basic principle from now on when you preach?
No, not when I preach, but when I did that once.
Yeah. Did you?
Yeah, I would read some scriptures, had everyone stand up there, and I read the scripture that is in the and sit down.
Yeah.
Stiff.
You had people muttering under their breath.
I just watched this guy, you know?
Yeah. You know, shake people up when they go to church. Shouldn't do that, Wes. Anyway, on the first day, there was quite an effective service. First 12 verses tell us the first day. And then verses 13 to 18 tell us what happened in the remainder of that week. For the following 7 days, the people observed the Feast of Tabernacles for the first time in many, many years. Okay? The week began with the gathering of the leaders. The heads of the families and the priests and the Levites got together with Ezra, and they realized in the reading of the law that they hadn't been keeping this, and so they preached to the people in Jerusalem, and they kept it for the rest of the week. Now that brings us to the 8th day of the 7th month, right? Now when you come to the first verse of chapter 9, it says, in the 24th day of this month, the children of Israel were assembled with fasting and sackcloth and with earth upon their head. The 24th day, so that's 3 weeks later, isn't it? from the 8th day to 24th, 21 days. 2 weeks later. So for about 2 weeks after the observance of the Feast of Tabernacles, the people had obviously remained in a spiritual condition because there was a great revival. And boy, this is a revival. Talk about it. Verses. I like to read verses 1 to 3. It says, "They were assembled with fasting and sackcloth and with earth on them. And the seed of Israel separated themselves from all foreigners and stood and confessed their sins and the iniquities of their fathers. And they stood up in their place and read in the book of the law of the Lord their God 1/4 part of the day." So they read for 3 hours, if you count it as a 12-hour day. They read for 3 hours, and another 4th part they confessed and worshiped the Lord their God. And you're talking about a 6-hour service. That's half the day. Reading and confessing. Eh?
And worship.
Yeah. As a result of this, the Levites stand up, and for the remainder of the 9th chapter, which I think is one of the largest chapters in the book, right to verse 37, they basically go through a history of the whole nation Israel, right from creation to their present state. And that's one of the great sermons in the Old Testament. Not sermon, but one of the great prayers. It's actually a prayer of praise. And at the conclusion of this great convocation, there were 84 people signed a covenant among the leaders of Israel under Nehemiah. Nehemiah was the first one that signed it, chapter 10, verse 1. There were 84 people that signed the covenant of commitment, that they were going to commit themselves back to serving the Lord. This took place in the 7th month. Brings us to chapter 11. Sometime, it doesn't give us a time frame now for the events that are taking place from this point on. Sometime subsequent to this great revival, there were about 3,044 people volunteered to repopulate the city of Jerusalem because there just wasn't very many people. If you add up those numbers, 3,044 people. And the first 19 verses of chapter 11. And then at the end of chapter 11, you have a summary of the little towns in which Jews had basically populated outside of Jerusalem.
So the first list of those are going to be completely saved.
Well, it says they voluntarily, verse 2, the people blessed all the men who willingly offered themselves to dwell at Jerusalem. Now these are the chiefs of the province that dwelt in Jerusalem. See? You mean had wives and children and
yeah,
stuff?
Yeah, say, well, we'll populate, we'll count it.
Okay. I think they moved in. That's what they meant.
Yeah, I know, but we were just saying that we were just leaving.
Yeah. It says earlier, I just forget what chapter it was, that it said that there weren't very many people in the city. I think it was way back when they were receiving opposition. Just forget where that is now. Oh yeah, chapter 7, verse 4. Now the city was large and great, but the people in it were few, and the houses were not built.
Just take them out the dock, it's New Testament times. It's about a kilometer and a half.
From wall to wall.
Well, long, it's more oblong than about a kilometer.
Well, when Nebuchadnezzar had come in, he burned the city with fire. He destroyed the wall and the temple and all the houses in it. And so there weren't all that many people living in the city, right? And so during this time, I'm sure you fit the book of Malachi in. where the people had rebuilt their houses, right? They were putting quite an emphasis on that, but they had gone overboard, and they were allowing the temple to go into disrepair. They just become materialistic, right? Now this took place afterwards because, well, I don't know. I don't think that this took place. I think this took place while Nehemiah was still there. I mean, something took place in the 12 years he was there. And all the events thus far recorded right up to the 10th chapter all took place within his first year. So I'm sure that chapter 11 is just part of Nehemiah's direction when he's trying to get more people back into the city. This is early on, right? We come to chapter 12, I'm sure Nehemiah was behind the summary of the genealogy of the priests. He summarizes just how many Levites and priests there were that had come back under Ezra years before. I think Nehemiah was behind the well, it actually says it in verse 47 of chapter 12, so I know this took place when Nehemiah was there. And all Israel in the days of Zerubbabel and in the days of Nehemiah gave the portions of the singers and the porters every day its portion, and they sanctified holy things unto the Levites. The Levites sanctified them to the children of Aaron. On that day they read in the book of Moses in the hearing of the people. And so, not only were the priests and the Levites recounted and the temple procedures were amended at the end of chapter 12, there was also a great separation, sort of like another little mini revival here. And then let me get this straight here. Let me just read verse 6 of the 13th chapter. But in all this time was not I at Jerusalem, for in the 32 year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, came I unto the king. And after certain days obtained I leave of the king. And I came to Jerusalem and discovered the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah in preparing for him a chamber in the courts of the house of God. And it grieved me very much. Therefore I cast forth all the household stuff of Tobiah out of the chamber. Then I commanded, and they cleansed the chambers. And there brought I again the vessels of the house of God with the meal offering and the frankincense.
Isn't that the same guy that was persecuted him before?
Yeah, it's Tobiah.
Yeah.
See, this is what I was saying before.
Right in the temple.
Yeah, moved right in, had a little apartment there. The household stuff. Verse 4, and before this Eliashib the priest, having the oversight of the chamber of the house of our God, was allied unto Tobiah. So in between, somewhere between chapter 12 and chapter 13 verse 6, there was a fairly lengthy period of time, probably, that Nehemiah was gone, and things kind of relaxed a little bit when he wasn't there in person. And there was an apostasy. He comes back and wham, bang, puts it right back in order, and restores the Sabbath, and just brings things back to tip-top condition. Interesting book. So I think you have to remember a few important people. The main individual, of course, is Nehemiah, but his brother Hanani is kind of an interesting guy. He's the one that first brought the report. He ended up being one of the co-rulers of the city of Israel, right? Asaph was the governor of the king's forest, and Nehemiah had the open door policy into the king's treasury.